theological perspective, that's God. That's the idea, is that there is someone, some standard for which or for whom what is happening here matters. And if you're a total materialist and you think once the material has been obliterated, that's it, I don't know how you can still have a sense that what has gone on while we've been alive has been meaningful. That's what I think is the biggest implication for now.
I would agree with that. But I would also add certain things, because it's interesting. If I'm a materialist, and there is no greater significance to meaning other than the materialistic world in which I live now, and my own biological existence, and so on and so forth, then such things as death and suffering and justice and love and all these other kinds of things that we find valuable are in fact rendered meaningless. So it then opens up the field for us to contemplate that if the things that we do don't matter, then we can do whatever we want. Justice goes out, an idea of justice or fairness goes out the window. Not only living with myself, but living in community with others would almost be rendered impossible to a certain extent because of the disruption of the kind of actions that I would do in light of this. And so really, the question of death is most pointedly the question of how we ought to live our lives. Now, in that particular respect, from a theological standpoint, how we ought to live our lives is one that ought to be lived in such a way that corresponds with who we are, so we'd have to know who we are. It would have to correspond with our final destiny, so we would have to know where we're going, and if it's just a matter of being carrion at the end of the day or fertilizer for the flowers in the field, that is going to radically change how one behaves in the world or acts in the world. But theologically speaking, since there is a life that is fulfilled beyond this one, because this is so finite and unsatisfactory, then one has to live, Socrates and Aristotle as well as Jesus point this out to us, we have to live in such a way that we know what is highest in the best, so that we can understand what, in fact, our life should be like here. So the discipline of the great classical philosophies, the discipline of Christian spirituality, is to live with an awareness of death in such a way that it reorients our values so that we don't become attached to gold. We don't become attached to consumerist mentality or whatever the case may be, because there's much more to life than that, and then those things can satisfy. And common sense seems to me to speak to that as much as philosophy and theology do.
Even though I think we agree on sort of the ultimate meaning or implication of this kind of finiteness of death on human life, I disagree that not having that context, or not having some kind of external standard, has to mean that then you feel that all is permitted. I mean, I think that Sartre and existentialists in general have shown how the impulse to live a moral life, even given, even assuming that this is all that there is, that there's plenty of sort of just fellow feeling, and so as far as a biological or psychological thing, whether that's enough to hold us together. I think that it is. I think that we tend to want to cooperate more than not, as well as just the idea of this is all we've got. Let's make the most of it. Let's make it good. I think that does work. As far as the ultimate meaning, that's where I think the problem comes in more drastically.
Well, before I give sort of a psychological perspective, I'll just briefly comment on what I said before. Namely, to disagree. I think that having a materialist system, which I think a good, rigorous, and truer form of psychology will be based on, doesn't necessarily entail meaninglessness, a sense of meaninglessness. The reason for this, in my opinion, is that meaning is a process, or an output is probably a better term, an output of a human brain, I think. And the relation of human brains or human nervous systems in complex societies, with concepts like language and things like that. And to me, such a thing is internally justified, and I can explain what I mean by that a little bit, by sort of recognizing that even though we don't currently understand how the nervous system gives rise to conscious experience, I would argue that it's probably a well-justified philosophical truth, probably the one well-justified philosophical truth, that we can be aware of our own experience. Sort of the classic Cartesian idea that I think, therefore I am. We can know that we think. We have to be thinking. We can't doubt that idea. And I think that holds a lot of weight, because although we don't necessarily understand how the material foundation gives rise to these complex experiences of love, justice, and meaning, and all of these things, we can still note that they certainly existed to some extent, even if at the end of the day they are just sort of the byproduct of molecules hitting one another in the brain. I still think there is a profound sense of meaning to be taken from that. It's just not externalized. It's meaning that arises itself from the brain that's recognizing it. At least that's my opinion. So I'll speak very briefly on the question of how should death affect the way we live. Obviously, death has affected us for our entire existence. It's sort of like an inevitability. There are a variety of psychological perspectives on the issue. The two most interesting that I'll talk about very quickly. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a doctor in the early 20th century, who wrote the famous book on death and dying. If anyone here has heard of the 5 stages of grief, that's Dr. Kubler-Ross. She had a lot to say, I think, that was extremely important about death and how it affects the way we live. And sort of recognizing, sort of shifting away from the idea that death is an intrinsically good or bad thing, and more of it's a phenomenon that we experience that is natural, and we have ways of coping with it, and there are better ways of coping with it. That is to say, ways that tend to work better for our psychological health, and there are worse ways of coping with it. So I think that one way death affects the way we live is it forces us to face something, face a considerable amount of suffering that we will need to overcome, or else fall to something like suicide, I guess, or some sort of very strong neurosis or psychosis. I think that's one function. Another thing that I find more interesting, and there's a lot to say on the psychology of death, but this is just the most fascinating one to me. There's a theory called terror management theory, which sort of arose, I think, in toward the end of the 20th century. And the basic idea is that human beings have this sort of fundamental death anxiety. They have a constant fear of dying, and it's an unconscious fear. And the argument behind terror management theory is that basically everything we do, civilization itself, science, philosophy, art, religion, everything, is a defense mechanism, you could say. It's a defense mechanism that we construct to sort of dampen the anxiety surrounding death. And the reason that it's proposed that such things work in that way is that those projects tend to outlast human beings. Those projects are immortal projects. A society lasts hundreds of years, religion lasts thousands of years, legal systems last, you can go on and on. But the idea is that in investing himself or herself in a project that will outlive the human being, they can sort of alleviate that death anxiety. And there's actually empirical research backing this up. There are some experiments that have been done to sort of justify that. Well, actually, I'll just say briefly, when human beings are put into a situation or a circumstance where an object of cultural significance is destroyed or needs to be destroyed in order to complete a task, so say you need to use an American flag in order to complete some sort of experiment or something, If the subject has been reminded of their own mortality through suggestion, like for instance in a questionnaire beforehand, they're actually less likely to use that object than if they aren't reminded of their own mortality. And so the conclusion that's drawn from that is, by suggesting to the subject, by reminding them that they are mortal, that they will die, you're sort of bolstering their defense mechanisms. You're reminding them that they're finite, that they're mortal, and that they need to invest in these large systems. So anyway, I've been talking for a while, so that's all I have to say.
Okay, I don't think that biological science has much to say about how we should live our lives. I think the answer would be somewhat dry and off topic. Basically, I would just say that what we know of biological science would suggest that if we value the continuation of our species, we make sure we have children before we die. But I would like to comment outside of the field that I'm representing, just on what else has been said. I agree a great deal with what Professor Patella said about overall meaning being forfeit if we recognize that not only ourselves but all of our society and our world and our universe ultimately are mortal and will die. But I also agree a great deal with Jonathan that in the absence of an external standard or an external sense of meaning, human beings would seem to have some kind of internal standard that they set themselves against. Even if we recognize that we're going to die and that everything ultimately will die, I think we would still be repulsed by seeing another human being suffer or even an animal suffer. I think we would still feel an urge to form societies, and we would still feel a sense of brotherhood with other people, and sisterhood, and whatever, not to exclude anybody. I think that we should recognize that death is, well, I won't say inevitable in light of the other things we've talked about, but I think for now it seems inevitable. And I think recognition of that should influence how we treat other people, and we should have empathy with them, because we are obviously all in the same boat, so to speak. And I think we should take time to appreciate the things that we have while we're alive. I think we should take interest in art and these other things that Jonathan was speaking of. Even if ultimately we're doing them because we're afraid, they still serve that purpose to make us feel better. I think also that if there's not an afterlife, or if we can't live forever, then this was said briefly. It would seem to me, on the face of it, that everything suddenly seems lawful, that you can do anything you want without consequences. It seems that way superficially. I think that it's a better thought that there are different kinds of consequences. You don't have to be punished by an external force to suffer the consequences of your actions. If you do something that you know is immoral, then you obviously feel distress. You feel like you've betrayed your sense of ethics. Just because someone isn't throwing you in prison or throwing you into hellfire doesn't mean that there isn't any consequence for what you do. And I think that even if we believe that there is no afterlife, or there's no continuation of life after we die, I think we can still recognize that there are things in those ideas that we like. We like the idea of peace. We like the idea of a common brotherhood and love between human beings. I think that we should try and work toward those goals now, regardless of whether there's a life after, because obviously it would be beneficial for us to do that if we were going to be judged on it, and it just seems to be a good endeavor in general.
Thank you. And St. John, you started sort of getting into this next question. It's been touched on quite a bit. We may not have a lot to say about it. But what, if anything, do you think occurs after death, and why? They can start.
Yes, you can start down that. All right, quick.
we've kind of progressively gotten away from any reasonable answer I can give from a biological standpoint, and now we've reached the absolute end of it. I don't think biology has anything to say about this, unless it's from more of a psychological viewpoint, that something in our biology gives rise to something in our minds that would be some kind of hint. As I have no idea. I don't think biology has anything to say, but since I have like 2 minutes and 30 seconds left, I guess I'll say something.
Could I pose something to you?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just thinking of William James and his idea that just because we see that material and consciousness, that consciousness is always a function of material, just because we see a correlation in every instance, he suggests, well, there's different kinds of functions. Is it necessarily that consciousness is produced by material? And he goes on to suggest there are other kinds of functions, like a transmissive function. Is it possible that instead of the brain producing our ideas, that the brain just transmits our ideas? And so that, just that question, would biology possibly be able to entertain that?
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that the ideas in biology preclude any idea. Like, I'm not saying they disprove the idea of an afterlife. I'm just saying that something like that would fall better, I think, into the realm of philosophy. That I just don't think empirical evidence in biology has much impact or much value for something like that. Which is, it's still a very good question to ask, and I think very interesting. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say.
Okay, so
Stop.
okay. Yeah, I kind of have to echo some of what St. John said. Since psychology is an empirical science, there's not a lot that a psychologist or someone researching psychology can say about what happens after death. So in light of that, I'm going to give my personal opinion, sort of kind of based on psychology. I don't believe anything happens after death. In the sense of, to be more specific, I don't believe that the personality in any way outlasts physical death. I think that personality is a function of nervous systems in an environment. And so I believe that when the level of complexity that's necessary for sustaining the personality, as St. John mentioned earlier, maintaining homeostasis and cell growth and all that stuff, as soon as that ends, I think that the personality ends. I am a materialist, so I would have to basically assert that. I suppose it's possible to some extent that if consciousness is founded or is a byproduct of physical processes, it's certainly possible that those processes, or the physical matter, could become redistributed and consciousness could arise in some other way. It would be well beyond my knowledge to say that when we die, our brains don't sustain consciousness in some way. I have no clue. I think that question probably relies upon a very clear, detailed understanding of consciousness and its relation to the brain. Although I do tend to disagree with William James on that point, so I do think that the brain isn't so much transmitting anything as it is producing something. My reasons for that, I guess we could go into later if we have more time. But as for now, that's basically what I believe about death, or what happens after death. The last thing I'll just close with, sort of to wrap up to my point in the beginning, is my personal opinions on death aside, psychology does have a lot of relevance to the question of an afterlife. And the thing that we can't forget in the discipline of psychology is that if someone believes in an afterlife, that's essentially completely justified in, for instance, a clinical setting. I believe, for most psychologists, I am generalizing to an extent, but the point is, if someone really believes, it's a very strong part of their worldview that life continues after death, basically serves it has a sort of psychological reality to it, which I think is just as relevant. That doesn't mean that I think that, I don't accept some sort of relativism where if you believe in an afterlife, then there will be one for you. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying in the discipline itself, in psychology, especially in